Hello, welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Allison Gampel, Associate Director of Alumni Programs at York University. Thank you for joining us today for Privacy in Virtual Classrooms. As this event is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, I do recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and its current treaty holders. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake region. Before we introduce our speaker today, I'd like to give you a quick update. If this is your first Scholars Hub event of the season, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the 2021-22 academic year. I am happy to announce that York safely reopened our campuses last week, and many of the activities that we have missed over the past 18 months, from in-person classes to extracurricular activities and just getting together to chat, have resumed. I'm actually here in my office on campus, which is a really nice feeling. The most up-to-date university planning information can always be found on our Better Together website at yorku.ca/bettertogether. We like to get to know our audience a bit better with a quick poll before each lecture. So today's question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll popped up on your screen, so I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Okay, great. Thank you for participating. It's always helpful for us and for our speakers to have an idea about who's in our audience and the knowledge that you have coming into the discussion for each of our events. So on the tech side, if you need any help with Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your questions. Our team is ready to help you. And that same Q&A button can be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period that will follow their presentation. For those of you watching live on Facebook, please feel free to submit your questions or comments through the comment section for the video, and the team will send them my way to ask on your behalf. Please do note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and to our staff working behind the scenes, so we ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. So on to today's talk. Today's talk features Jan Schwartschneider. Jan is an assistant professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at our Lassonde School of Engineering at York University, where he leads the Privacy Rhythm Research Lab. We are delighted that he's here to join us today. So welcome, Jan. You can turn on your camera.
Thank you, Allison.
Okay.
Really great to be here and looking forward for a great discussion.
Fantastic. So I'll let you share your screen and I'll be back after your presentation.
Right.
Thanks.
Let me just do that. Hopefully you all see my slides, and thank you all for joining. Thank you it's really great to be here and to discuss this very relevant topic of privacy in virtual classrooms, and I'm looking forward to getting your questions and discussing some of the work I've been doing in the area. So I'm a computer scientist, and I usually like to start with the good about technology, and I think there's plenty of that. Technology helped us and continue to help us with the challenges that we face, and during this pandemic we certainly saw how technology was enabling us to continue work and provide education with its own challenges, but still something that really made it possible for us to continue. And in fact, technology was actually also at the front line of helping us dealing with the coronavirus and trying to find solutions moving forward. So there's plenty of good and beneficial to society things that technology brings to the table. In my work, however, what I'm trying to understand and examine is whether those services and technologies that we're using essentially respect our privacy. And unfortunately, on that side, there's also a lot of issues that become to be available more recently as we adopted and moved so rapidly into this online world. Especially with education, we saw software that monitors activities. We saw software that essentially surveils students online without their consent. And we see a lot of those cases where there's some issues with how this technology respects our privacy. And this is really the core questions that I'm dealing with my research and my work. However, in order to answer that question, I guess we should all agree on what is privacy. And it sounds maybe a trivial and a simple question, but if you are tuned to the news or you've heard discussion and you're following what's going on, you actually notice that there will be a few different definitions surrounding different dichotomies about what is privacy. One can be defined as privacy, private versus public, or you can hear about personal information versus non-personal information, or it can be actually positioned as the individual privacy versus the government, or even as keeping something a secret, well, as opposed to sharing something. And as we look at the news and discussions, we see that there is constantly essentially a cherry pick of one definition that aligns with what you think is the correct definition of privacy. In my work, I was trying to find a framework that captures that all and provides a consistent way of reasoning what is a privacy violation and how would you actually define, including all of those subcategories. And that framework for me is contextual integrity. Contextual integrity essentially was proposed by Helen Nissenbaum in her book, Privacy in Context. And I really recommend reading it. I think a book was published in 2010, way ahead of its time. A lot of the issues that it is warning us about actually manifest themselves today. And in that book, Helen posits that privacy is really about context. And contextual integrity essentially is a framework that helps us understand what that is. What's important is that it's not about secrecy. Privacy is not about keeping something a secret. It's not about even data minimization, as we hear a lot in the news. It's not about defining something procedurally, something that if you've used any service, you've noticed when you try and click I agree on the lengthy document fills with jargon and language that you might not even fully understand, but by agreeing, you are considered to be informed by all the practices that they offer. So informed consent is a model that is currently followed, and contextual integrity says, well, that's not exactly what privacy is. According to contextual integrity, privacy is about appropriate information flow. Now, I would like to stop here for a second and understand that meaning, because that's essentially the basis for the follow-up discussion. I'll give you a brief primer on contextual integrity, the ABCs. So, according to contextual integrity, privacy is about appropriate flow of information. You can ask, what does appropriate mean? How do you define what is appropriate? Well, in any given context, there are norms, societal norms that essentially develop over the years that govern what is appropriate. I can give you an example of you going into your doctor's office and sharing medical information with your doctor. There are societal norms that govern that interaction. What do you share and how that information further propagates. So the appropriateness of information is essentially defined by those norms. I would like to also note that norms come from different sources, not necessarily laws that often actually lag behind or miss some of the expectations and normative thinking that the society have. And this is actually manifests itself in current topic that I'm going to discuss in education. Contextual integrity also provides you with the framework to analyze, to capture those norms and see whether the information flows that manifest themselves within the context deviate from those norms. And to do that, it provides you with, it tells you that you need to provide 5 essential parameters. You need to specify who is the sender of the information, who is the recipient of that information, what is the information about, who is the subject of that information, and what is the constraint, what is called transmission principle on that information flow. Coming back to the example with the doctor, imagine you come to the doctor, so you are the sender of the information when you're giving your medical record to your doctor. The doctor is the recipient. You're giving presumably your medical information, so you are the subject. And you're doing it under the assumption this information flow is essentially confidential. So the doctor won't be not about to share it with somebody else. Stating all 5 parameters matters, because if you change one of them, let's say instead of a doctor, suddenly this information flow of your medical data goes to your colleague or somebody on the street, that might not be as appropriate as you would expect. So that you're feeling that you feel that something is off, something deviates from the norm. That's where contextual integrity says, that's where privacy is potentially breached. Having that framework as a lens, we use that as computer scientists to understand whether the services that we introduce into new contexts, like established contexts like education, health, essentially follow and adhere established norms. And this is what I'm going to use throughout this talk. What's important to understand is, what are those norms? How do we capture them and understand them better? That's the key challenge. And the topic of today's conversation is education. There is a lot of norms that we establish as a society of what's supposed to happen in the classroom, how information should be conveyed, by whom and between whom, and what information should be collected and and what information should be left out. And those norms are essentially now being disturbed by new technology that are being introduced into our classrooms. A lot of those questions I'm trying, as Alison was mentioning, to explore in my lab, privacy rhythm, something that essentially focuses on 3 main challenges. One is, as I was saying, discovering privacy norm in different contexts. We looked at education, health, emergency situations, and so forth. And then as a computer scientist, we would like to build system that essentially incorporate those norms and privacy expectations into the system. Finally, throughout this work, we use this knowledge and what we learn to inform policymakers and also emerging technology, developers of emerging technologies, to let them understand that their new technology they introduce will essentially have to adhere to all the norms that already exist, established norm in those contexts, something that the law sometimes doesn't reflect. And this was essentially the topic of our recent work in collaboration with a few universities in the US to work out on understanding what are the new technology that we introduce in our classroom, what are the privacy harms, and how we can actually deal with that. So this work was with Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton University, as well as NYU and School of Information at Illinois. And this work essentially started with understanding and reflecting on the new landscape, the new threat model. So certainly there are privacy issues when it comes to educational context, something that scholars were examining way before we moved online. But the new threat with this new technology has changed the situation completely. Data is much more easily captured and is visible by the platforms and the instructors, as well as students. So easy to grab that information, and the vast majority of different types of information that you never used to capture in the classroom, you're now able to capture, and in most cases is being captured. So another element to it is actually the idea that new types of information flows. I'm presenting this from my home, and potentially you can see my living room. Same with students. They can see each other's homes, environments that can indicate new type of information. There's socioeconomic indicators, factors that involve that can affect all types of things. So those information flows are not considered before, something that the new technology put on the front line. Obviously, data is more easily disseminated by the platforms themselves. There are new actors like third parties that essentially engage with this information for different purposes that have maybe no relation to educational purposes that previously we were engaged in. And last but not least, obviously, the new platforms, because they're digital and all, they're actually vulnerable to attacks. Basically, you have what they call essentially adversaries that can hack into the system, retrieve that information, and share it for unintended purposes, and as well as essentially interfere with the course itself. You heard about Zoom bombings and things like that. And this is certainly disruptive to the overall education of everyone involved. In our analysis, to understand this picture better, we essentially surveyed 49 instructors around the US and from different disciplines. I have a backup slide that shows the variety of different topics that they teach. We also talked to 14 administrators at the US universities to essentially understand the type of technology they are using, then use the lens of privacy analysis and security analysis to analyze those popular platforms, and you see a list of them here, that are being used by those instructors to understand what are the privacy issues and so forth. We also analyzed 129 state laws related to dissemination of information, of educational information in the US. And we perform a technical analysis of their security features, something that I'm not going to touch today, but it's in the paper, and I recommend that you go and check it out. So with instructors, we looked at how they look at privacy, and we noted that over half of them indicated they are concerned with security and privacy issues. And they were particularly concerned with the information share that is happening with third parties, and emphasis on the personal data as well as the course data. So they weren't sure where the information goes and whether it's appropriate for it to go to those third parties or otherwise shared. And they also were concerned with surveillance, both of instructors as well as students. Again, a new information flow, new technologies allow to convey that information, and they weren't sure that it aligns with what they would expect to be present in the lecture hall. When it comes to administrators, although we only had 14, notably they raised a few interesting issues. In some institutions, there was no formal institutional process for selecting a new platform. So it was almost an ad hoc. And you can understand this happening maybe during a pandemic when it's an emergency, but moving forward, we really need to look at those issues, because certainly understanding what are privacy implications before you engage with the platform is very important. They also marked that the selection process is guided by the faculty and IT, so there's no input from the students and other actors that are involved with those platforms. Something I will touch on at the end as one of our recommendations. And some noted that reevaluation of a platform actually happened just at the contract renewal. So there is no continuous feedback that comes in and essentially tries to understand what are the issues that some of them can do. All right, so for our analysis, what we did, we used contextual integrity framework to annotate those privacy policies that those platforms provide us to understand what type of information flow they prescribe and proscribe. And this table kind of summarized some of the interesting findings that we found. Obviously, the paper has more. One is that in most cases, the burden of monitoring where information goes and whether the third parties essentially keep that information, keep your respect your privacy, is on the user. So if you add an add-on to a particular, to your system, that add-on can be a third party essentially grabbing all the information And you have to validate that that's not actually the case and the information flow is appropriate. We also noted that some of them explicitly say that they may share personal data with advertising, something that I guess in a typical lecture room you would expect. So definitely something to look at. There is also a bidirectional sharing in a way that information goes both ways, both to the third parties as well as aggregated information from third parties going back into the system. So there's quite a few information flows going back and forth without really understanding whether it's appropriate. They also may collect data from social media. Each time you add a social media add-on, that add-on will grab some information and that information will be shared with the social media provider, which can be very concerning. Another type of information that we look particularly closely was location data, because we have a particular attitude towards this type of information, especially in the context of education. So there's, as you saw, concerns about being surveilled and so forth. So a lot of those platforms explicitly permit location tracking, and they actually can share that location with third parties, as well as grabbing location from other places outside the device that was provided. And I won't burden you with the technical details, but the idea itself that you can get information, that aggregated location information, and for other purposes than that you would expect, this is certainly a place for concern. All right, so hopefully I alerted you to some of those issues. Obviously, the paper has more discussion on it, and we certainly would like to engage more deeply in each of them. What's interesting is what can you do about it? And the idea here is what we notice a lot of, some of the, no, I wouldn't say a lot, but some institutions use the data protection addendum document. This document allows them to specify additional rules to those that are generally available in the privacy policy to negotiate with platforms policies that will adhere closely to educational values and norms that the institute essentially consider appropriate. We noticed that some of them actually were using the template that platforms provided them, because for them, for the platform side, it's much easier to have that template to onboard other institutions and say, hey, yeah, we get it. Educational context needs a bit of adjustment in what we do and how we collect information. Let's use our template. And essentially, that's a place to negotiate. We found that about few of the institutions actually used the template, but others actually tweaked it and had one template that they use for all third-party new platforms that they used. There's some variation about how data is accessed and how long it's being retained. So those rules were actually tweaked quite a bit. So that's the place, that's a tool, one tool, and a bit of a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, but that's a nice tool at least to have a way to push back and say, hey, whatever you stated in the privacy policy might not reflect the values we have in education setting. Let's discuss what information can you collect, who you can share it with, and what is not okay with us. All right, getting towards the main takeaways and recommendations that we essentially tried to get out of this study. So our study revealed substantial gaps between the norms of established norms in context and the way the norms that are governed by current markets, right? A lot of those technologies are actually not designed for education purpose. They're designed for general purpose of remote communication. Those purposes are not those information flows that they generate sometimes, as we saw, are not aligned with the norms of educational context. Same goes with regulation. What regulation says, what the privacy norms say, and what actually happens, there are substantial gaps in there. And we need to address those through different means, both by talking to the developers of those platforms and discussing that they should essentially follow community privacy norms with established context, and in this case, education. That conversation should happen early, and it should be iterative. So there's a constant feedback and pushing back and saying you should provide us with ways of aligning your technology with the norms that are governing in this particular context. So we have to identify those privacy concerns, identify those privacy harms, solicit constant feedback both from the students, from all involved that using those technology, understanding where things can go wrong, and then using the tools that we have both in legislation, but also with something like a DPA. So data protection addendums documents can essentially help you provide additional constraints or additional alignment with those. So universities certainly should use those. And essentially that engagement should be constant. Software developers should be committed to getting that feedback and should be committed to improving their servers based on the feedback provided by the institutes. Something that is starting to happen, we saw, but very slowly. A final point before I'll be wrapping up, and an important one, something that Helen Nissimon warns us in her book, and it's the tyranny of the norm. Usually when the new technology is coming into our space, into our lives, we're using and we kind of get accustomed to a lot of it. So your toaster will be tweeting, your fridge is going on and proposing your content on posting your content of the fridge on Facebook. It feels at first something is off. You don't feel right about it. But as time goes on and most technology introduced, we get accustomed to it, and essentially this whole thing becomes a norm, and it becomes so normal, so we cannot actually challenge it in court because the court will say, well, that's the norm right now. This is what happens. So we have to be very careful to challenge that before it becomes this new normal that we might not be so comfortable with. And with that, I'll finish my talk, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Information very interesting.
Alison, I don't
Stop.
think, yeah, there's a bit of a delay when you, yeah, you're cutting off. Is it me? Maybe it's on my side. I cannot hear you.
You can't hear me.
No, I cannot see you too. Is it me? Maybe. Technology, technical issues. Alison?
Hi, Jan. We're just
Hey,
trying
Jenny.
to.
Yeah.
We're
Is
just.
there an issue with? Is it me or?
No, no, it's not just you. I'm just trying. We have a backup host, so I'm just trying to get that moving on the back end. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm sorry, everyone.
Yep.
Hello.
Hey there.
Hi, thanks for your patience while we work through that.
Yeah, as a computer scientist, this is normal. I feel like, yeah, we're failing society. We cannot get a Zoom working. So that's on us.
I know.
Better systems.
I know we're so accustomed to doing this now, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience. So we do have some questions for you. And the first one is, do these findings apply to Canadian universities which use many of these tools?
Right. Thank you. Absolutely. I think obviously the study was for US universities. And as you would know, we're using Zoom right now. Everyone is using Zoom. So it's kind of international. A lot of those technologies are led by companies that are international, they're big corporations, and they will essentially have a say in what they collect and so forth. So this is definitely relevant. And a lot of the technologies are used by Canadian universities. So I joined York, and certainly there was no change in what I use. I'm teaching using Zoom. I'm using Moodle. So a lot of the technologies that we examined essentially are the same in Canada. And I would imagine the issues, some educational norms that we had in US, Canadians will have the same, or even so, very close to, so we have to examine those. So the issues are still very, very valid. You know, we're still trying to see if we can run another study to make sure it's with Canadian universities as well as Europe universities as well, because there are different policies and law regulation that are involved in those areas as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you know where York is sort of on the spectrum in terms of Canadian universities and using this technology? Are we sort of?
It's York is a top university, so it tries to it aligns with the top in terms of using the cutting edge technologies, and we're using Zoom for now, and those are used in those, at least the colleagues from for this study from Princeton and NYU and all that, basically we're using the same technology. So certainly not an outlier in that, and that's normal. We're trying to get students get the education, and this is an emergency situation, and part of our work is actually understanding what changes. So obviously during the emergency, your normative thinking changes. You're gonna want to get on with things. You want to continue surviving, and then with that notion brings some decision making that might stick around after the emergency situation. And then the question is, when does that happen? Like, when do you actually know that this is over? Should we have like a stop and then everything roll all back? Well, historically, a lot of the technologies will stick around. So it's very important for us when we introduce, or at least now that we kind of settle in some kind of routine, to examine and understand what are they actually doing. And it's happening. It's not that this study is the first. We actually there's a collection of studies that goes in and tries to understand what they're doing and understand what are the implications and potential privacy harms as we move forward. And certainly when the next emergency comes in, and unfortunately we have to plan for that, it will be important to have this process in place. And when you choose a platform, you kind of know what it needs to do, and you have the right tools to negotiate so it aligns itself with what is the established norm in this particular context. And yeah, I think we are trying to do that. So there's a lot of work though. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for the perspective as well. That's something that President Linton talked a little bit about in the town. There was a town hall yesterday and talked about, what are we going to carry from this going forward, and how is it going to affect our teaching? And there are some great learnings, and there's some things that do need to go back.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. This is our unprecedented times. So we all new to this, and certainly, privacy is one issue that is in. But I'm working with colleagues that essentially introduce other. Well, there's so many, a variety of issues, societal issues, that privacy just plays one particular element, but it's not all of it. There is other things, what those technologies just do and how they affect us as a society. And in fact, this whole experience and actually working on those projects is a bit eye-opening, because as computer scientists, we tend to be, ones and zeros. That's basically our way of looking at the world, but and looking at everything as an engineering problem. And what I was lucky to be involved in the projects that I've been involved in, I'm working with philosophers, social scientists, information scientists, and you need all of those expertise to essentially build systems that align with what we as a society think is appropriate and ethically defendable. So it's not necessarily just an engineering problem. Engineers, computer scientists should be part of a bigger picture, and so I say everyone should have a philosopher on their team when they come in. So that's an important. And Helen Nissenbaum is the founder of that theory, but a community at large is trying to build those bridges between technologists as well as policymakers to make sure that it's kind of all works together to align with expectations. Because right now, things are a bit ad hoc, and we kind of have to live with that. But maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can a bit push back, and yeah, that's part of it. That's part of the journey.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience around privacy. And the question is, why are we so concerned with privacy for students with online learning when they regularly share their whole lives on social, especially sort of
that's the argument. Yes,
middle school years and up.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, so I will kind of step back and again come back. What is privacy? And privacy is appropriate flow of information according to contextual integrity, and I subscribe to that definition. So it's not about secrecy. It's not about not sharing. It's sharing in an appropriate way that is aligning with what the society feels, or even sometimes what your expectations are. So it's okay for a student to share if they okay with that information flow of their personal life going on Facebook. For me, that's not a privacy violation. What is a privacy violation is that when they are in the classroom, their information, the fact that they are in the classroom and everything they're doing is captured without them actually knowing, or at least looking at, and then it's posted on Facebook. So that's potentially an inappropriate flow. You have to essentially justify it, present it to, let's say, a student and say, hey, there is this new information flow that might deviate from what you would expect. So when you're in the classroom, there is a camera that will broadcast this to Facebook. Are you okay with that? And if they are okay with that, then maybe we should align our expectations. But the notion itself that they should keep everything a secret is based on the definition of contextual integrity, is not necessarily a privacy violation. It's not about secrecy. It's about appropriate flow of information. And it actually works really well as a philosophical theory of privacy, reduces really nicely into computational problem. We essentially have a flow of information, which is so convenient for us as developers to think of, as engineers, to think of flow of information and put constraints based on the higher level of understanding and expectation. So those things help me understand those issues and then build systems that align with what students and maybe us as society think is appropriate. But it's a great question. Yeah. It kind of comes back to this argument of I have nothing to hide, but that's a different topic. And that's not necessarily, the point of this.
Yeah, that's a different lecture for sure.
Yeah.
Another question we have for you is what is the information privacy situation in Canada?
Yes, so actually, this study again was really focused on the US, and I'm not a lawyer, so there was a lawyer on the team, part of the computer Center for Information Privacy Information, CATP, Center for Information Technology Policy. There was leading the policy lab and essentially advising us on some of the legislations that are existing in US regarding privacy. So there's FERPA, Federal Education Act, Privacy Act, that governs what flow of information are appropriate according to that act within the educational setting. Canada has as well a set of laws that essentially looking at governing what they, personal information. And the issues are very similar. The issues we have with the US legislation and Canadian are very similar because they are focusing on the type of information being shared. Remember the second slide, I think, where I was discussing that you can define privacy as a dichotomy of personal, non-personal. So if it's non-personal, it's okay to share. If it's personal, then it's not okay to share. And then you get into this discussion of what is personal, like what considers the personal information. So certainly there are some categories that we can all agree on, but even that non-personal combined with other information can become very identifying and personal. So the laws themselves at the moment, including US and Canada, look at the types of information and trying to restrict it. They will say your employer cannot conduct personal information from you. But that's really not very helpful because there are a lot of information types, new information types that those new technologies capture and generate that essentially are not captured by the law. And they're not okay because they're essentially trying to, well, they're not aligned with what we consider the norm. And we often say the law is often lagging behind this whole new technology introduction into those contexts, because the type of information is great and they cannot just pinpoint everything saying you cannot share this or you can share that. So we would like to push that to go through the lens of the 5 parameters. Give me an appropriate flow. Tell me where this information going, from whom, about whom, and what are the conditions. Is it confidential? Is it public? Then I make a decision. So the landscape is very similar in the approach. Obviously, the law is different, but certainly there's a lot to be done. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm happy. I'm planning to work with the law school to work on that.
You know, it's so interesting because it's we're global, and
Yes.
part of what's come out of this pandemic is just how global we are and how is a student in school using technology. It's really common that the students are using, it could be a program from Canada or a Canadian developer, or it could, a lot of them are from the US. So
Yes.
it's good that the policies are similar, but in terms of governing and editing and watching it, there does
Yes.
need to be some kind of collaboration there.
Yes, absolutely. I think the global nature of it all certainly presents some challenges in creating the consistent set of rules that essentially policies that align. There are some there were in the past agreements on a legal level to do that. But again, we need to reassess the whole notion of informed consent that we have across the world. Basically, every time you have a huge document of 10 pages saying, hey, this is what we do, you get it, right? And you say, I agree, you just agreed to everything. And there's a whole bunch of websites that essentially sometimes highlight what you agree to share. And you would not even know about it. You just hope that there's some body of legislators or policymakers that keep track of that. So this is not normal. You're not informed. This burden is not on you. It's basically it's really tough for any user. I've maybe reading those privacy policies in more detail. I don't even sometimes get what they're actually saying. It's so confusing. So there's a lot of work to be done to have a consistent way of thinking about privacy. I think this work tries to push towards the direction of having a much richer expression of what is appropriate. So not just the dichotomies of, oh, you don't share this or you share that. It's really the whole context. Who you're sharing it with, under what condition, and you have to explicitly state that. Because otherwise, there's so many ambiguities in our other work. One paragraph that we took from one of the platforms was translated to 100+ information flows that presumably you just agreed on. What happens is you come in with a particular mindset of that, and you kind of assume, you fill in the gaps. So if you're left with a gap, you're just filling what you think is appropriate, but that's not necessarily what is stated. So very interesting, and hopefully we'll get to fix that.
Okay, we have another question from the audience, if I may, and it reads, it's from S. Paul. Asks, as an alum, how do you deal effectively with issues like intellectual property and ownership of content published or shared online, potential identity theft, etc.? What safeguards or measures can you take to mitigate?
Wow, that's a big loaded question. First of all, there's parts of this question that I'm not an expert in identity theft and all the legislation around it. There are some. I will pick the parts that I can answer to, and that is how do you feel more, well, try to ensure that your privacy is respected in a way. It's tough because a lot of those technologies will collect data in the background. You have to be careful. There are some guides out there. What do you share with whom? You have to be at least curious about where this information is going and where it might end up. And often it's about finding a way to ensure that this there are no other information flows, but really it's tough. I feel that right now to put that burden on the user, it's a challenge, because with everything that's going on, you basically just dump everything with the privacy policies, with technical expertise, everything on someone to figure out. That's where I come in. I'm trying to build technologies that essentially will ask you, or at least understand what your expectations are and notify you. There are some other kind of efforts that, for example, will have an add-on on the browser. Whenever you interact with the service, it will highlight that there's some issues with some of the elements, some of the practices that they do. Let's say they collect your location, so you should be aware. So they warn you. Or when it comes to collecting your location, obviously you can use a particular browser that doesn't allow you to stop that sharing without recommending in particular. So there is now more awareness by those platforms that people are essentially interested in keeping information, in sharing information in an appropriate way. They don't use the term, but they're essentially trying to provide you with tools. The problem is that's all over the place. There's no like one way, push that button. Maybe there's not going to be one, but still there are tooling out there that help you at least manage some of it. But I agree, it's a challenge. And the other parts of the questions add to it. What happens afterwards when this information is shared with unauthorized parties and they use it in means that you don't wish to anyone to be in that situation. But yeah, there's quite a bit of a challenge for that to happen.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jan, and we're so fortunate to have you and your research team on this and working on this technology.
Yes, we're going to fix it in the afternoon, so let's come back to me next time. We'll fix it, but it's a global challenge, and I welcome the feedback and as well as the question, and we'll definitely trying. It's a huge issue, and the pandemic made it even more precedent. So we should certainly focus on it, and we're trying to do our best as part of a larger community. And certainly it's the challenge is in front of us, and I'm grateful for your providing me with the opportunity to get the resources to work on it. So this is great, and I hope I'll come with good news next time around, just to say we'll solve it. But yeah.
I'm sure that will come. So thank you so much for your time today and for your patience with our little technical difficulty there.
Yeah.
You're welcome to turn your video off now. But before we say goodbye to our audience, thank you also for your patience with our technical difficulty there and for taking the time to join us today. We do have one last question for you, and that is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this conversation? There should be a pop-up on your screen there. So please join us next week on September 29th for the Key to Equity and Inclusion in Online Classrooms, Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic. In 2 weeks from today, on October 6th, we have another Scholars Hub for creating opportunities for youth with the Kindergarten to Industry Academy at the Lassonde School of Engineering. For information about these and all of our events, please visit our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Until then, thank you so much for joining us today, and keep well.